Hey, Money Mike, that last series we did was pretty research intensive, so I was thinking to decompress. Why don't we write and edit the longest episode we've ever recorded? And then to segue into a series on John McAfee, let's write and record a side episode or two on the absurdly complex history of the dominating political parties in the United States and how they flip flopped over the last 300 years.
Yeah, that sounds pretty easy. Let's go ahead and do that. Chapter 1. Why the fuck did we do this? And going in, what should we be expecting? So, okay, before we dive into this story, a couple housekeeping items. One, we are going to be talking about American politics, and that shit can get downright dicey. While we each have our own affiliations and personal ideologies, we're going to do our very best to remain as objective as possible. I doubt that we will be completely successful in this venture, but know that our hearts are in the right place on this one. Second, in American politics today, the following ideas tend to be synonymous: the right, the conservatives, and the Republicans. And then on the other side, the left, the liberals, and the Democrats. However, as we are going to see in our story, this hasn't always been the case, because these things aren't objectively synonymous. The left and the right is entirely dependent upon what the center looks like at a given time in history. Republicans and Democrats, on the other hand, are political parties, and we will see their platforms shift considerably depending on what period of American history we're talking about. What we're going to be dialing into in this episode are those last two ideas: liberalism and conservatism. Unlike the other two, these are philosophical ideologies that date back to the writings of people like John Locke and Edmund Burke. And while the individual beliefs of conservatives and liberals have changed over time, there have been a few juxtapositions that have remained steadfast over the past 2.5 centuries. And they can be best illustrated by answers to the following questions. One, are people created equal? And how should that dictate the power structures of our society? Liberal philosophers like John Locke would say, yes, people are equal. And because of this, everyone has equal value and should be given equal chance. Locke believed in the idea of a clean slate, that when we are born, we're kind of blank pages, and the pictures of our lives that get painted have a ton to do with our circumstances. Basically, we can be anyone we want to be. Conservatives, on the other hand, would say, no, some people are inherently better than others, and the function of society should be to put those people in power and then create social structures to keep them in power. Now, I don't personally believe this, but if a conservative philosopher thought that men made better decisions than women, they would consider it a disservice to society to allow women to lead.
And if there's instability, it is as a result of a woman in leadership, let's say.
Yes, that when shit goes wrong, it's because we have the wrong leaders in place, not because the system is inherently broken. The system is good. And the second question is, what is freedom in the context of a society? A conservative would tell you that freedom is the ability to decide the course of one's life, to achieve your genetic potential without interference from an overreaching government or other people. A liberal, on the other hand, might say that freedom is the ability for everyone to have the ability to participate in the movement of a society towards a better world. Equal access, not equal assets.
We like this theory because it goes some distance to explaining why, in past generations, people have gotten more conservative with age. When they're young, they want entry points into the economy. They want their piece of the pie. And as they get older, they want what they've built to remain safe from disruption. Now, personally, I've always been extremely unclear on what people believed and when in our political history, and what compelled America to, at times, commit atrocities and be some of the very worst people imaginable. The answer to this question is two pursuits that are at odds with one another and can be dictated by that one single word: freedom. To greatly oversimplify what Money Mike has so eloquently broken down, and to kind of give this an easy to repeat few bullets that we'll be re-mentioning as we progress through the story, just to kind of connect the dots, here are our two definitions. Freedom either means refuge from the disruptive power of others, or the opportunity to be disruptive for your own benefit. Again, the existence of these two things demands compromise, and we're going to use these two definitions of freedom to trace the objectives of the two prevailing political parties of today's America, Democrats and Republicans. And these parties, by the way, have each spent time catering to conservatives and liberals.
We have to break the bond between conservative and Republican and liberal and Democrat because they're not the same thing. But anyway, now that we've got all that boring philosophical stuff out of the way, let's jump in to chapter 2. A two-party system is born.
Yes. According to the public school I went to as a kid, America was the first land discovered and not always inhabited. There are some key flaws with what I just said. The year that Leonardo da Vinci turned 40, Christopher Columbus led the first wave of sea pirates, as Kurt Vonnegut calls them, to America, effectively discovering, quote unquote, for the modern Europeans, the second half of the Earth's landmass. Christopher Columbus didn't do too much exploring to the south of where they landed, but Spain as a whole did, and they happened upon a mass fortune in the way of gold. Bloody, bloody, bloody gold. England looked on as Spain committed horrific atrocities and amassed an enormous golden fortune, and they decided they're better than Spain, therefore they should have some bloody gold also. Genesis 1. In the beginning, blue-eyed Jesus created the Protestant movement and the New World. The United States was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Lord was hovering over the waters. And white Jesus tore the cape of stars and stripes he was wearing on his back and proclaimed, "Let there be capitalists!" And there were white, dreamy-eyed, bloody gold-seeking capitalists. Or maybe that came later.
I didn't pay enough attention in social studies.
But anyway, these settlers were pretty jazzed about this new landmass and were eager to get the word out. So they strapped a bunch of letters to their pet bald eagles or something, carefully, to make room for enough AR-15s for the long journey. They swore in letters home and to their investors that there was gold in the mountains of Virginia, just like the Aztec stuff, which is what many of them were sent to North America to find. By 1620, though, 3/4 of the 6,000 gold miners sent to what would become Jamestown by the London Company of Virginia would die, and the remaining quarter would survive by just growing tobacco, effectively giving up. This was the first wave of what would become America. People getting duped by grifters using the promise of gold to sell tickets to cross the Atlantic. The Plymouth Rock stuff came towards the tail end of this multi-decade stretch, and that's where Billy Graham first makes his appearance in the South.
When I saw pictures of that guy, I thought he really might be that old.
He looks like a pilgrim.
He did look like a pilgrim. But anyway,
From here, the country grows. Satan enters the picture unsurprisingly. Snake oil salesmen come and grow and come and go. It's weird putting dates to this, but this moment predates consolidated ideologies of any sort, really.
at least in the sense of liberalism and conservatism.
Yet liberalism is yet to emerge anywhere, and conservatism won't really emerge as an ideology until the French Revolution. Freedom really isn't a thing at this point. So there isn't a conversation to be had on what freedom really means. Everyone in the world here is either ruling or being ruled.
You're either part of the upper class and you have a limitless amount of freedom and freedom to bestow your ideas on others, or you are not and you're kind of surviving.
Yeah, in choosing to make the voyage to America, both definitions of freedom are present, but they aren't yet organized. Gold diggers are coming here for the right to be disruptive on their own, to conquer a land without being told by specific rulers what they can and can't do, and they're still beholden to those rulers somewhat. Somewhere in the next century and a half, A bunch of wealthy English folks throw a tea party pretty close to that, the Rock, Plymouth Rock, as luck would have it, and then declare independence, and this place would become a country all of its own. In January of 1789, George Washington is elected president, securing 69 of the 69
Heyo.
electoral college votes. So at this point, it's safe to say that the newly independent Americans agreed on a lot. Tobacco enemas are a medical miracle. Slavery is at the very least necessary, and witches and wizards are real and need to be killed. They still believe that here.
In really bummer ways too.
We need to put rocks on them until the rocks make them go squish.
Dude, random side note, according to my grandmother, and this could be completely false because you know how grandmas are, because grandmas tell you that like you have Native American in your blood and it's really African American, but yeah, no, my grandmother said that I'm apparently related to the guy who got pressed to death.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
The one whose last words were more weight.
which I mean,
So metal.
obviously those genetics did not get passed down to me, but but yeah, allegedly, like a massive, like grandma level, allegedly, I'm related to that guy.
Nice. Grandmas love studying genealogy. They're all about it.
They love genealogy because they love
Yeah.
what am I trying to eugenics.
Yeah, I
Anyway,
know. Yeah.
my grandma's dead, I can say that.
Mine too.
She died before ancestry.com, so I never had to deal with that. But anyway, so another actual side note here. George Washington is famous for bemoaning the idea of the two-party system.
Yeah.
But it's fairly evident that that is kind of how everything started. From the very beginning, when our little country was just peering out of the Statue of Liberty's vagina, there seemed to already be two fairly defined political factions at the negotiation table as the Constitution was being ratified. These were the Federalists, founded by Alexander Hamilton, and the Anti-Administration Party, founded by a trio of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Henry Tazewell. Tazewell. I actually don't know that guy's name.
I don't either. Never heard it.
While the story, of course, is more complicated than we have time to dig into here, the main point of contention between the Federalists and the Anti-Administration Party was the nature and power of the federal government. The Federalists, as the name suggests, favored a strong central government over fractured state governments. They really weren't about the French Revolution or Napoleonic Wars, and the Anti-Administration Party was kind of just anti all of that. They didn't want things like a central bank, something that the northern urban merchants were super down for, but southern rural farmers didn't really like the idea of. The nature of these parties was far different than the political parties of today. I don't think anyone was ruining Thanksgiving with poorly parroted diatribes that they stole from 30-second clips on Twitter.
They were ruining Thanksgiving by making one witch joke, and everyone's like, that's not funny.
They were ruining Thanksgiving by murdering Native Americans.
Yeah.
But
They were making the witch joke, and their parents were like, that's like 9/11, and it's been that way for the past 900 years. You don't joke about witches and wizards, boy.
These potatoes are so good. It's like magic. It's like fucking what? But anyway.
The hard
Anyway.
M.
Yeah, the hard M. Jesus fuck. But I think it's interesting how ingrained the idea of two opposing powerful political parties are in the American psyche. And how even in the very beginning, geography and profession seemed to have a pretty measurable impact on the party that people tended to align with even 200 plus years ago.
Yeah.
What's also interesting here is that from a modern perspective, the Federalists were viewed as right wing, and the Democratic Republicans, which is who the Anti-Federalists would become in the coming years, were viewed as left wing.
So the anti-federalists, the ones that wanted small government, were viewed as left-wing.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. Which, when you look at a short list of their platform, it might really challenge how we think about the idea of the whole modern left versus right debate. And this goes back to the idea that we mentioned earlier that the values espoused by the modern American conservative right, represented by the Republicans, and the modern liberal left, represented by the Democrats, just haven't remained static throughout history. I also think it's really interesting that certain people idolize the idea of the founding fathers. Like, George Washington would hate this, or Thomas Jefferson would be rolling over in his grave. It's like, you mean the guys who owned slaves and thought that magic was a slur?
One
Like,
of these guys, if not every single one of them, at some point shot tobacco into their asshole. And they had other people's teeth in their mouths, and they were just horrifying monster men.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's true. I have no additional notes.
Yeah, so as this thing started out, though, and George Washington gets elected, there's plenty of kumbaya,
Yep.
but overseas, some shit's brewing. 4
Oh, yeah.
months after his election, the French Revolution, check out our episode on French protest, would happen, and Edmund Burke, an Irishman serving in English Parliament, had some ideas on the matter. Heads were going to roll, figuratively this time. You see, although the French were fighting for a just cause, their own liberation, the way they were going about fighting for it was unacceptable to Burke. It was ungentlemanly, and thus the goal of the French revolutionaries was corrupted. It is insane how long this soundbite has persisted. Also, he didn't much care for the democracy thing of it all, favoring instead the merits of monarchy. Many consider this right here the moment that conservatism, I think it might be conservatism.
It is conservatism, and that's so fucking hard to say.
I hate it way worse. Conservatism as an ideology was born, and it makes rounds quickly. If things must change, they should do so within the boundaries of the social norms we've already created. Many of the people in high up positions deserve to be there.
This is gonna remain steadfast our entire conversation.
Yep.
Back in America, the anti-federalists or the anti-administration party had fully morphed into the Democratic Republican Party or the Jeffersonian Republicans, depending on which history book you're reading. And it is the infighting in this party that will truly give birth to the next 200 years of American politics. Think of the Democratic Republican Party as two gigantic lactating titties that the right and the left are just suckling on, trying to grow up big and strong. I'm kidding, kind of. I just really wanted you guys to think of titties. But
They're going to go to whichever titty is going to nourish them most effectively at that moment.
yes, actually, it's far better than I just wanted to say titties. But
We actually can use the titty metaphor now. This is great.
it is actually a metaphor, not just me saying titties a lot. But anyway, in the early 1800s, the Federalists were getting weaker and weaker due to their refusal to support the War of 1812. And the Anti-Federalist or Democratic Republican Party were gaining more and more political ground. So what happens when we no longer have a common enemy to focus all of our angst on? Well, of course, we fight amongst ourselves. And this came to a head in the election of 1828. And the Democratic Republicans split into two distinct factions. One, those who supported the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and they became known as Jacksonians, or simply the Democratic Party, and those who supported the presidency of John Quincy Adams, and they became the National Republican Party, who would then become the Whigs under Henry Clay.
I gotta tell you, Jacksonians sounds like a space cult that shoot each other's nuts off as an initiation
Which is
ceremony.
actually somehow less crazy than everything Andrew Jackson thought of. So for simplicity, I'm just going to copy paste directly from Wikipedia to talk about what these two parties thought. So the Jacksonians, the Democrats, stood for individual rights and state rights,
States' rights.
supported the primacy of the executive branch over other branches of government, and opposed banks, namely the Bank of the United States, high tariffs, modernizing programs that they felt would build up industry at the expense of farmers. The Jacksonians styled themselves as the party of the common man. Presidents Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and James K. Polk were all Democrats who defeated Whig candidates, but by narrow margins. I'm no longer quoting at this point, but Jackson had a populist appeal. Who does that sound like?
Yeah.
In the terms of modern American politics.
Democrats, obviously. Just kidding.
We love the everyman. We love the farmer. What's also interesting about the Democrats at this time is they kind of came up with the idea of political parties becoming a feature of your social life, not just politics. National Republicans, on the other hand, advocated for the supremacy of Congress over the executive branch, as well as policies of modernization and economic protectionism. Central political battles in this era were the bank war and the spoils system of federal patronage. I'm quoting from
Mm,
Wikipedia for that. So again, the parties weren't flipped, but they certainly were far cries of how we think of them today.
true that. For the most part, these early Americans would basically all be considered fascists.
Yeah. So anyway, in that election of 1828, Andrew Jackson would emerge ever so slightly victorious. He was a subscriber, unsurprisingly, to what would soon be called manifest destiny. And this phrase was used to describe the belief that God wanted white Americans to continue expanding westward until they hit water. Remember, those who have power are supposed to have power. So, in the interest of westward expansion, Andrew Jackson wrote the legislation that would cause the now infamous Trail of Tears and would decades later lead us to finally reaching the Pacific Ocean.
Now, super not fun topic here, trigger warning, everything else. It is now the time that we must address slavery and the tensions that it brought about during America's westward expansion. Everything about slavery in the United States is a fucking nightmare, but
Oh,
during
yeah.
westward expansion, slave owners were desperate to maintain at least 50% of the Senate. When California applied for statehood, this balance was threatened. For the Democratic Party to stay united, a compromise was needed. The approval for California's application for statehood, therefore, required the adaptation of a more strict Fugitive Slave Act and the admission of a few pro slavery states and some anti slavery states. And everyone sours on this legislation pretty quick. Compromise.
We don't do that here in America. This is America.
Unsurprisingly, this sort of catalyzes a rift to form between the pro slavery folks and the Democratic Party. Southern slave owners wanted the West to be pro slave to preserve their way of life. 50-50 Senate split, remember. And the Northern Democrats wanted poor white farmers to have some edge in claiming this freshly stolen land. Wealthy slave owners shouldn't be able to continue taking everything. To attempt to appease these two groups, the Democrats passed the Kansas Nebraska Act, which put slavery in two huge territories up for a vote, which is a terrible idea.
We love the idea of democracy, but it only takes one person on the wrong side of that vote to really fuck some shit up.
Yeah, let's take two diametrically opposed groups and have them vote on behalf of their own livelihood. I'm sure this will stay civil and orderly. This unsurprisingly led to a lot of bloodshed, and the fallout from this led to the Democratic Party splitting into a northern anti-slavery faction and a southern pro-slavery faction just before the election of 1860. By the way, what this has effectively done is made the northern United States anti-expansion of slavery and the southern states pro-expansion of slavery. Unfortunately for the Democrats, the timing of this feud gave the White House to the newly formed Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln took the White House, and right away the pro slavery states began leaving the Union. They refused to be governed by someone who was against the expansion of slavery. The key operative word here is expansion. Republicans in 1860 spent a ton of time assuring people that slavery wasn't going to end, it just wouldn't be permitted to grow. They even offered to enshrine the right to own slaves in the Constitution for the states that already allowed it. Obviously, this offer was refused, but the reason Republicans wanted to prevent the expansion of slavery was because it was a threat to free labor, a misleading and very ironic name for the idea that with hard work, anyone should be able to become successful. Now, what does that sound like in our freedom dichotomy? The opportunity to be disruptive on your own behalf. In this moment in time, Republicans were fighting for free labor, aka social mobility, basically, a meritocracy, all kind of liberal things in the grand
Yeah.
scheme of things. They were
Okay.
kind of a liberal movement.
Yes, there's a lot more nuance there, as I'm sure we both know.
There's a
But
whole nother episode of just
yeah.
nuance in this very moment. But and
Yeah,
there's a whole lot of incidental shit that makes them more liberal than they otherwise would be. Again, they are
yeah,
anti the expansion of slavery, not because they care about black people, but because they want white people to be able to move up in the world.
yes,
Moving west represented significant opportunity for workers, and slavery as a feature of any economy makes penetrating the job market pretty fucking hard. Why would a slave owner train you to do something they'd have to pay you for if they can just force someone else to do it for free for the rest of their lives? Anyway, we all know what happens next. According to the History Channel, aliens intervene on behalf of the North, who then won the war, and the institution of slavery was brought to an end. In return, the aliens insisted that we put the weird pyramid thingy on our dollar bills or whatever. This was pretty fair, if you ask me. The Republican Party had gotten everything it sought and more.
at the price of, like, a lot of people dying.
More people died in this than any other,
Yeah.
conflict in America, but,
Yeah.
dollars, pyramids,
Whatever.
aliens, this whole
Yeah,
thing.
whatever.
It was a
Whatever.
pretty cinematic moment in America's history. Effectively, they got way more than they'd bargained for. They came in seeking
Yep,
a bill to halt slavery's expansion, and they wound up just abolishing slavery outright and
yep,
securing the allegiance of a freshly liberated voting demographic. Also, a good number of these Northern Republicans amassed unimaginable stockpiles of bloody gold during the Civil War,
yes.
and they quickly ascended the ranks and began promoting their interests within the Republican Party. As such, the party began to steer its interests away from black liberation and towards those of these wealthy industrialists and financiers.
The tide is turning.
Yes.
Chapter 3. Hey, everyone has light bulbs now.
Over the next 65 years, the Democratic Party, bitter about its pathetic loss to the Republicans and their alien compatriots, finds the vast majority of its electorate in the American South, and Republican support still lies in the North, although by 1929, the influence of big business is plainly visible through the now thin veil of free labor, quote unquote. Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican president from the turn of the century, founds a progressive movement called the Progressive Movement to advocate for the rights and betterment of the people. But this movement loses some pretty key traction after 1920. Supporters of the party that once stood for black liberation and workers' rights, the Republican Party, were now advocating for a hailstorm of bullets to meet workers' rights movements where necessary.
Because their interests changed.
Their interests have changed. It is freedom from disruption,
Yeah.
not freedom to disrupt at this point.
Because they already disrupted. They don't need to be doing any more disrupting. They just need everybody else to stop disrupting so loudly so they can count their disrupting money.
They need all those other people to keep away from their bloody gold, baby.
Exactly.
They're relatively indifferent to race and will sometimes even act in favor of non white Americans, but this is typically when the needs of non white Americans align with the needs of the bloody gold. The Democrats, still a very conservative movement, are all about race, and also the rich kind of run the show on this side too.
Oh, yeah.
In 1929, though, the Republican Party's luck runs out. The Depression brings America to its knees, and this time it's the Democrats, led by FDR, who swoop in 1932 to offer assistance via the New Deal. Now, although this fiscally liberal move constitutes a big and lasting ideological shift to the left, the Democratic Party still catered to their Southern conservative base in the execution of this broadly liberal legislation. The Federal Housing Authority, FHA, which was founded in 1934 under FDR, would only offer mortgage insurance to whites. They'd refuse this insurance to houses in mixed race neighborhoods and would refuse mortgage insurance to houses near mixed race neighborhoods.
Keep in mind, gang, this was less than 100 years ago. While some consider the New Deal one of the pillars on which the American dream has been built, it was exclusively and explicitly applied to white people. This isn't a correlation or a statistical inference, it's written public policy. Now, while FDR's attitude towards black Americans would soften, and some would say even warm towards the end of his presidency, FDR would be considered, by modern standards, probably kind of a racist asshole. But It is during this time that the quote unquote black vote starts shifting to Democrats
Yep.
due to FDR's espoused ideas about race,
Yeah, he's the one guy kind of giving black people a break.
which is a low bar.
Yeah. Very low bar.
Still bad.
Still bad. Also, FDR's administration was super not friendly towards Jewish people during World War II, only allowing 22,000 German refugees entry into the United States, despite the fact that Americans overwhelmingly approved the admission of however many came. A proud little moment for Americans.
Yes.
Not their people in office, but Americans as a populace.
Yeah, they're all right.
Yeah. What FDR was trying to do here was trying to prevent the Depression as much as he could from disrupting day to day life for his constituents. This is why the FHA was founded, but didn't extend to African Americans, and why nothing in the New Deal was offered to Hispanics. He was fighting to preserve the ever valuable freedom from disturbance. This was still, to some degree, a conservative push. It was just on behalf of his current constituents.
Yep.
However, the people in the Republican Party and the current holders of the bloody gold were having none of this shit and objected rabidly. This opposition to government intervention and the remaining policies from the New Deal is a core tenet of Republicanism today. This is one of the rare scenarios where both parties were trying to defend freedom from disruption for their own constituents and butted heads. And the Republican
Yep.
Party maintains the resulting beliefs and sentiments about the New Deal to this day.
For sure. And, to our story, the Democratic support of the New Deal marks one of the more dramatic steps in the switch in the values of the Republican and Democratic parties that has evolved ever since Lincoln's presidency in 1860 to today.
Mm-hmm.
But a few years later, George Bush just flew some planes into Pearl Harbor and Fox News started. Wait, that can't be right. There were no
Is that
steel
hold
beams.
on? Oh shit. No,
Oh,
fuck. Actually, money, I'll tell you exactly what's happening here. We ran out of time and are going to have to do the rest in a part 2 episode. We didn't
dude,
see this
that's
coming.
it. We didn't at all. We
That's
didn't at
what's
all.
going
Well,
on.
gang, surprise, part 2 on the way. And
Yep.
this one is going to be a lot less history and a lot more dense because we've been recording history a lot better for the past 100 years than we did for the 100 years before that. So, tune in next time to hear about how these parties really start to switch and how the ideas of conservatism and liberalism have evolved over the past 100 years.
And then after that, John McAfee.
Oh, he's coming, baby. He's coming.
See you next time. He is coming.
And
Goodbye.
goodbye.